History doesn't always reveal itself in books. Sometimes it hides behind locked doors, sealed walls, and forgotten rooms, waiting silently for decades. Tonight's story isn't just about the past. It's about what the past tried to keep buried. In the autumn of 1918, when the world was collapsing under the invisible weight of disease, there existed a cabin so isolated that even the maps of the time seemed to forget it. Hidden deep within a forest that rarely saw visitors, this wooden structure stood like a forgotten scar upon the land, weather-beaten, leaning and wrapped in silence so thick it felt almost alive. The air in that part of the woods was different, carrying a strange stillness, as if sound itself had learned to walk more quietly there. Locals avoided the area, not because of stories told for entertainment, but because of something far older and more deeply rooted: fear shaped by memory. Even children were warned that if they wandered too far, they might stumble upon a place that should never be seen by curious eyes, a place sealed not just by wood and iron, but by a silent agreement passed from generation to generation. During the peak of the deadly pandemic, when entire families locked themselves indoors and churches fell silent, that cabin became a place of strict isolation. It was not sealed to keep people out, but to keep something in. The nurse who occupied it was sent there under desperate orders. She was not sick, not at first. She was chosen because she volunteered to treat patients who were too far gone to remain in town, those whose coughing shook the walls and whose fevers burned so intensely that even loved ones were too afraid to stand close. The cabin became a final station between life and death, a place where the sick were brought when the living no longer knew what to do with them. As fear spread, so did rumors. People spoke of screams echoing from the forest at night, carried by the wind like dying prayers. Lantern lights were seen flickering through the trees long after the cabin was supposed to be locked for the night. Footprints appeared in the mud, leading toward the cabin and never away from it. But the door remained firmly sealed, bolted shut with heavy timber and iron, as though those who sealed it were terrified of what might escape rather than what might enter. Over time, the cabin took on a reputation that went beyond sickness. It was described as a place where time did not move normally. Shadows around it appeared longer, darker, wrong in ways that could not be explained by simple sunlight and trees. Birds avoided the branches above its roof, leaving an unnatural emptiness in the sky above it. Even hunters, men hardened by survival and solitude, would lower their rifles and turn back when they realized they had wandered too close to that patch of forest. They said the air tasted metallic there, like old blood soaked into the soil and never washed away. When the pandemic finally loosened its grip on the world and towns slowly began to breathe again, the cabin was not reopened. Instead, it was sealed tighter. Boards were hammered across windows. The door was reinforced. The path leading to it was left to be consumed by weeds and thorns. Officials marked it as condemned, but no one returned to tear it down or cleanse it. It was easier to pretend it didn't exist than to confront what it had contained. Decades passed, and the cabin became a myth wrapped in silence. Parents warned their children to never follow strange trails in the woods. Teenagers who dared each other to go exploring always turned back before reaching it, guided by a deep instinctual dread they couldn't explain. Trees grew twisted around its walls, roots gripping the foundation like bony fingers, slowly trying to pull it back into the earth. Yet the structure stood firm, stubborn, as if it were holding on to something still unfinished. What made the cabin truly terrifying was not simply that it was remote or old, but that it was sealed in a way no other building was. Not abandoned, not forgotten, but deliberately locked away. It was quarantined from time itself. Every nail driven into the wood felt like a warning. Every iron bolt felt like a confession no one dared to make aloud. It was a place frozen in the exact moment people realized they had lost control over something they could no longer understand. Even before it was ever opened, historians who studied old pandemic records noticed something unsettling. Official reports spoke of supply drops to a location that was never named. Logs mentioned a remote treatment station with no coordinates. Names of patients sent there were removed from public records years later. It was as if the cabin didn't just disappear from the forest, but from history itself, buried under intentional silence. And the most haunting part of it all was the thought that whatever remained inside that sealed cabin had been trapped there since the world was too afraid to look back, waiting in the dark, untouched, undiscovered, and breathing in the silence ever since. She was known only as the nurse who never came back, a woman whose name faded from records, but whose presence lingered like a ghost in the memories of a frightened town. In the chaos of the 1918 pandemic, when hospitals overflowed and graveyards grew faster than churches could pray, she stepped forward when others stepped away. She did not hesitate, did not question the risk, did not beg for safety. She walked into the heart of sickness with nothing more than her training, her uniform, and a quiet determination that unsettled the people who watched her leave. No one understood why she volunteered to work alone in a remote cabin far from town, but they were too desperate to argue. At first, she was seen regularly. A supply wagon would arrive every few days, and there she would be, standing in the cabin doorway, masked, gloved, eyes darkened by exhaustion. She spoke little, only nodded, only gestured. Her voice, once gentle and warm, became thin and strained, as if even speaking required effort she could no longer afford. People began to notice small changes. Her posture became rigid, her movements slower, more deliberate. There was something distant in her eyes, as though she were no longer fully present in the world around her. Then, one day, she stopped appearing at the door. The supply wagon still came. The food and medical crates were still left on the steps, but no one opened the door. At first, they told themselves she was resting. She was tired. She was overwhelmed. Then days passed, then weeks, and the cabin remained silent. No lantern light, no shadow moving behind the curtains, just wood, nails, and quiet so deep it felt like a hand pressed against the mouth of the forest. Inside, no one knew what was happening. The nurse had vanished without a trail. She did not return to town. She did not send a single message. Her name disappeared from hospital rosters. Her records became incomplete. It was as if she had been slowly erased, layer by layer, from the world she once belonged to. But strangers passing through the woods swore they sometimes saw the cabin's window glow faintly at night, a pale flicker that vanished the moment they tried to look closer. Villagers began to dream about her, not ordinary dreams, but strange ones. They described seeing a woman standing at the edge of their beds, face hidden in shadow, breathing slowly, watching. They woke with the feeling that someone had been whispering to them, but they could never remember the words. Children cried that they could hear footsteps circling their rooms late at night. Mothers claimed they could smell sickly, sweet chemicals in their homes even though nothing had been spilled. Her disappearance didn't stay locked in the cabin. It leaked outward into minds, into sleep, into the quiet spaces of imagination where fear grows best. Years passed, and still, no answers came. There was no official investigation, no newspaper headline, no funeral. The system was too broken, too busy burying bodies and repairing shattered routines to care about one woman who walked into the woods and never walked back. Her disappearance became a story told in fragments. A rumor passed between lips that never dared to speak too loudly. Some said she had died alone in that cabin. Some said she had been taken by the very sickness she tried to fight. Others whispered that she had never been alone in the cabin, even from the beginning. What made her vanishing truly terrifying was the lack of evidence. No blood, no struggle, no forced entry. The door remained bolted from the inside. The windows were still nailed shut. It was a disappearance sealed by silence, protected by walls that never moved. A locked room mystery, frozen in time, untouched by logic, surrounded by fear. The very laws of reality seemed to bend around the question of where she went and how she vanished without leaving behind even a single trace of fear or desperation. Old paper trails, when uncovered decades later, only added to the unease. Expenses were logged for food meant for 2 people, not 1. Additional medical supplies were delivered that were never explained. A second bed had been noted in an inventory list, then crossed out hastily in shaking ink. These small details hinted at something hidden, something unspoken, something never meant to be found. And the most disturbing part was that the last written record of her existence was not a farewell, not a warning, not a confession, but a single unfinished sentence written in shaky handwriting that simply read that she was no longer alone in the cabin and that someone or something had started answering her in the silence. When the cabin was finally opened after nearly a century of silence, those who stepped inside expected only decay, dust, and the brittle remains of a forgotten life. What they found instead felt like walking into a room where time had stopped breathing. The air was thick and damp, carrying a smell that should not have survived through decades. a mixture of old medicine, stale wood, and something faintly sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long on a grave. Light from their lanterns fell across furniture that had not been moved, as if someone had simply stood up one day and never returned. The wooden table stood at the center of the main room, and on it lay medical tools arranged with unnatural precision. Scalpels, forceps, glass syringes, bone saws, and stained bandages rested in neat, almost respectful rows. Rust had crept across the metal, but the placement was careful, deliberate, ritual-like. This was not the mess of a panicked worker abandoning her post. This was the work of someone who wanted these tools to be found exactly as they were. Along the walls, shelves still held dozens of glass bottles. Some were cracked, some clouded with age, others tightly sealed. Inside them were darkened liquids and gritty sediments that clung to the glass like dried veins. Handwritten labels had faded, but a few words could still be made out, words that did not belong to any standard medical practice of that time. Remedies, purifiers, sanctifiers, binding solutions. These were not words of science, these were words of belief. In one corner of the room, a chair scraped marks into the floor as if it had been dragged across the wood again and again. The scratches formed uneven, looping patterns, almost circular, carved by nervous hands or restless nights. The chair faced a section of the wall that had been deeply gouged. Symbols were carved there, not clean, but frantic, overlapping, and chaotic. Lines crossed through each other, circles were broken and rewritten, and strange shapes repeated over and over, as if someone had tried to copy something they did not fully understand. The journals were found beneath a loose floorboard, wrapped in cloth and tied with twine. When opened, the pages trembled from the slightest movement of air. The handwriting changed as the entries progressed. At first, the words were careful, professional, structured. Dates were clear. Symptoms were documented. Treatments were listed. Then the writing shifted. The letters grew uneven. The words crowded together. Lines slanted downward like they were being dragged into darkness. She wrote about patients who stopped responding to pain, about eyes that stayed open long after breath had ended, about mouths that formed words without sound. She described how the cabin felt different at night, as if the walls moved closer, as if the shadows stretched longer than they should. She wrote about hearing footsteps outside when no one was there, and breathing that did not belong to her echoing softly through the thin wooden walls. Tucked between the pages were drawings, not medical diagrams, but twisted sketches of human figures with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. Faces were scratched out and redrawn again and again, as if the original features were never right. Some figures were drawn with their mouths open, impossibly wide, filled with dark scribbles where teeth should have been. Others showed torsos split open and stitched back together with irregular, jagged lines. Beneath the table, a metal box was found buried partially into the floorboards. Inside it were items wrapped carefully in cloth. Locks of hair tied with string, teeth placed gently side by side, fragments of bone that were too small, too deliberate, too human to be explained away. Alongside them were charms, crude talismans made from string, wood, and bits of corroded metal shaped into unsettling forms. Every object inside the cabin carried the same feeling. This was not the work of madness alone. This was the work of purpose built on fear. It felt organized in a way that could not be dismissed as simple desperation. It felt like preparation, like planning, like a slow shift from healer to something else entirely, something driven not by science but by whispers that lived in isolation and darkness. The deeper they went into the cabin, the more they realized that what had happened there was not an accident. It was a transformation, recorded carefully in ink, carved into wood, preserved in glass, and hidden beneath old planks. Whatever the nurse had become inside that sealed space had left behind proof not of chaos, but of devotion to something unseen, unheard, and still unexplained beyond the crackling lantern light that barely dared to reach the darkest corners of the room. As the evidence inside the cabin began to make sense in fragments, a far more disturbing picture started to emerge. One that suggested the nurse's actions were not random, not born purely of desperation, but guided by something that twisted logic into ritual. Isolation did not simply break her mind. It reshaped it into something methodical. The fear of death was no longer something she fought against. It became something she studied, something she tried to understand through acts that crossed every line she once swore to protect. The boundary between healer and experimenter faded day by day until there was no boundary at all. In her later journal pages, the language changed completely. Medical terms disappeared and were replaced with words that felt ancient, heavy, and unnatural. She no longer wrote about patients, but about subjects. She no longer described treatment, but process. Her words suggested she had begun to believe that sickness was not simply an enemy to be defeated, but a doorway, an opportunity to reshape the human body and spirit. She wrote of suffering as a necessary step, a sacred stage that could not be avoided if something stronger was to be born. The evidence hinted that she began experimenting not out of cruelty but belief, a terrible kind of belief, wrapped in desperation and loneliness. When death became too common and medicine failed too often, she seemed to turn to older ideas, forbidden ideas, ones that blended folklore, superstition, and fragments of half-understood science. She believed that the body could be pushed beyond its natural limits through controlled suffering, that close contact with death could awaken something dormant inside human flesh. Some journals described procedures performed by candlelight. She wrote of tying veins, limiting breath, using pressure to force reactions from the body. She documented changes in pulse, in skin color, in eye movement. It was written with the calm detail of a scientist, but the intent behind it was something else entirely. She was no longer trying to save lives. She was testing how close someone could come to death without fully crossing into it, and what might happen if they were pulled back at the last possible moment. Strange preparations were also found among her supplies. Powders ground from unknown sources, herbs dried and mixed in ways no official medical guide would ever recommend. Liquids brewed and sealed in bottles that carried no real labels, only symbols carved into the corks. Some mixtures were meant to numb pain, others were meant to heighten it, some were meant to slow the body, others to awaken it abruptly. The pattern suggested she was searching for balance, not between health and sickness, but between life and the edge of death itself. The arrangement of the cabin supported this transformation. The central room was no longer simply a living space. It had been subtly turned into a working area. Furniture was shifted to create a circular path around the table. Candles had been placed at equal distances, their wax hardened into thick pools that stuck like frozen tears to the wooden surface. Marks on the floor showed where she paced during long nights, walking the same path again and again, as if tracing a ritual route worn into her subconscious. The most alarming signs came from the alterations made to the structure of the cabin itself. Boards had been removed and replaced, not for repair, but for access. A concealed compartment had been carved into one wall, large enough to hold something human-sized, yet too narrow to be comfortable. The inside of this space was scratched, clawed, and lined with the same symbols found elsewhere. It wasn't a storage space, it wasn't a shelter. It was a chamber built for a very specific purpose, one that spoke of confinement, observation, and something that should never have existed within such a small, sealed place. There were signs that the nurse had not worked alone near the end. More sets of footprints were found preserved in dust. Chairs had been placed opposite each other as if conversations had taken place. Handwritten entries appeared in different ink, with slightly different handwriting, responding to her thoughts in unsettling agreement. These replies were not comforting or corrective. They encouraged her work, strengthened it, approved it. She began to write that ordinary medicine was weak, that nature had hidden truths that only the desperate could uncover. She wrote that the cabin protected her, that the sealed walls kept out doubt and allowed her to listen to what could not be heard in the outside world. She claimed that suffering purified intention, that isolation sharpened understanding, and that what she was doing was not evil but necessary. Every page, every mark, every object showed that this was not madness born from chaos, but a slow, deliberate evolution of belief, carried out in wooden walls soaked with fear and guided by a vision of transformation that no human mind should ever have followed so willingly into darkness. Behind the last loose plank of the cabin floor, hidden so carefully that it seemed meant never to be found, lay the final message that changed everything. It was not written with ink, not carved neatly like the symbols on the walls, but scratched deep into the raw wood with something sharp and unforgiving. The lines were uneven and desperate, cutting through splinters and knots in the timber, as if the act of writing itself had become a violent struggle. Whoever created those words had pressed so hard that the wood had cracked, as though the message had been forced out of fear rather than thought. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that no careful sentence ever could. They were not orderly. They were not calm. They repeated unevenly, overlapping in places, with some letters cut so deep they nearly split the board in half. It did not read like a warning meant for the world. It read like a confession made to the darkness, something that had been clawed into existence when the mind could no longer hold the truth in silence. The message spoke of realization. It suggested that the nurse had finally understood something too late, that whatever she had believed she was controlling had never been under her control at all, that the strange presence she felt in the cabin was not a product of stress, sickness, or isolation, but something that had been listening from the beginning. It implied that the rituals, the experiments, the symbols, and the suffering had not been discoveries she made on her own, but instructions she had been following without fully realizing who had been guiding her hands. The deeper the investigators read into the message, the clearer it became that she was no longer writing as a scientist or a nurse. She was writing as someone who had seen behind a curtain that no one was meant to pull back. She described the cabin as no longer being just a shelter, but a threshold. The sealed walls were not meant to protect her from the world, but to trap what had already crossed into it. The air was no longer simply air. It was described as watching, waiting, pressing against her lungs every time she tried to breathe. She wrote that the patients were never the only ones being changed. She was changing too, slowly, quietly, piece by piece. She described moments when her reflection in cracked glass no longer matched how she felt inside. Her hands, once steady and familiar, began to look foreign to her. The sound of her own breathing at night began to feel like it belonged to someone else standing just behind her, close enough to feel, but never close enough to see. The message revealed that she had tried to stop, that she had tried to reverse what had been done. She wrote of scrubbing the symbols from the walls until her fingers bled, of smashing bottles and throwing tools across the cabin in a burst of terrified defiance, of kneeling in the center of the floor, whispering prayers she had not spoken since childhood, hoping that something older and kinder than what surrounded her would finally answer. But nothing answered. Instead, the silence grew heavier. The shadows stretched farther. The small sounds in the night grew closer. She began to realize that sealing the cabin had not trapped danger inside. It had trapped her with it. She was not the keeper of the locked door. She was the one locked in. The final lines of the message were so deeply carved that the wood had splintered outward as if trying to reject them. They spoke of a truth that had shattered everything she thought she understood. She was never trying to cure anyone. She was never the one in control. She was simply preparing them. The sick, the dying, herself. All of it had been a preparation for something that did not belong to medicine, science, or even madness. And in the very last, barely readable scratches, hidden between fractured grain of the wood, was the most horrifying realization of all, that whatever had been guiding her was no longer trapped inside the cabin with her, and it had already learned how to walk out into the world disguised in human breath and human skin.